Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this joint FSR NYU episode of the FSR debates. Today, we will be exploring a highly relevant and often controversial topic, that of voluntary carbon markets. While they offer the potential to support global climate goals, they also face critical challenges, and we will dive into these issues with our guests. We're trying to offer some insights from the perspective of Europe and the US. The aim of the session is to look into the complexities of these voluntary carbon markets and discuss ways to improve their effectiveness and credibility. We will start with keynote speeches from Nat Cohan, President of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. We also have Damien Meadows. He's an advisor on European and international carbon markets at the European Commission Directorate General for Climate Action. Then we will go into the panel debates, which is going to be moderated by Christoph Graf from NYU. And here we will have representatives from consultancy and academia to debate the issue. We have Peter Biss, Senior Advisor at Rad Pedersen Public Affairs, and Gregory Tren from Kyoto University. And then finally, Simone Borghesi from the FSR Climate team will offer some conclusion and wrap up the session. Before I pass the floor to our keynotes for their intervention, I would like to remind our audience to feel free to engage with us and our speakers through the Q&A chat box at any point during the session. And we will get to your question in the second part of the debate. Now, without further delay, over to Nat for his intervention. Please.
Well, thanks very much, Marcia, and thanks very much to FSR and NYU for having me on. I am Nat Cohan. I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. As Marcia said, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan-based nonprofit organization focused solely on climate and energy issues based in Washington, D.C. We work on U.S. policy issues, but also on international climate policy. And in the last several years, we've gotten very engaged and involved in the voluntary carbon market. So I think I'm here in part to be the voice to help say why the voluntary carbon markets can have such enormous potential, what's needed to meet that potential. I do want to say, I know the title of the webinar is the Skepticism justified? I think in some ways it is justified, but I hope to convince you, or at least to make the case that, and explain why I think the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets, can still be a very important part of the solution to mobilizing the climate finance we so desperately need. There are issues absolutely that we need to address. There have been real concerns about integrity and quality in the past, but I think they are addressable. There are efforts underway that I'll talk about to address them and to fix them. And I think the potential for the voluntary carbon market to provide a very unusual and sort of a very important source of finance, I think is too important to be overlooked. So I wanted to say a little bit about what I see as that potential, what I think the potential for the voluntary carbon market is, what it can contribute in terms of climate finance, and why it plays a potentially important role. Second, I want to talk about what will be needed, what kind of conditions will be needed to make sure the voluntary carbon market reaches its potential. So what do we need to do to address some of those integrity issues and to make sure that the market scales in a way that really drives climate outcomes? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about looking ahead to the future. What do we think, where do we see the voluntary carbon market go? And in particular, I want to highlight the role of government, which I see as being very important potentially in helping to structure and ensure the integrity of the voluntary market while while sort of respecting its voluntary character. Before we start, I assume, I think probably most people in the audience know what the voluntary carbon market is, but I think it's always useful to explain that and make sure we're on the same page. So the voluntary carbon market is the name given that, in some ways there are many different aspects of the market. There's many different players, but at the heart is the idea of a carbon credit that is generated for 1 ton of emissions reductions or removal from the atmosphere. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a ton or removing them from the atmosphere and storing them. There are a range of methodologies that are used to produce these. There are a range of carbon crediting programs that oversee those methodologies. But at its heart, the idea is a voluntary carbon market is a market for those credits that represent ideally real emissions reductions or removals, and that are typically used by companies, by corporations to meet their voluntary climate commitments. So that's what distinguishes the voluntary carbon market from the compliance carbon market, such as the European Union's emissions trading system or similar systems in California and the northeastern United States and Quebec and elsewhere around the world. The compliance carbon markets, firms are regulated and they're required to participate. And in the voluntary carbon market, it's important to understand that participation and the use of these credits is purely voluntary. As I'll say, it's sort of overseen and kind of quasi-regulated by a number of voluntary bodies in the voluntary carbon market, but the participation is up to the companies, and that's very important. So, why do I think that the voluntary carbon market has so much potential? Well, let me set the stage. These numbers are probably familiar to many people, but there are lots of numbers out there, lots of estimates out there about the additional climate finance needed to drive the clean energy transition. I think the International Energy Agency is the one that's most often cited, perhaps. And the IEA says that we need to mobilize or drive about $1.6 trillion a year into emerging economies and developing countries outside of China by the 2030s in order to stay on a path to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So $1.6 trillion a year, that's about 6 times what we mobilize today. So there's a huge need to increase climate finance. Most of that, the lion's share will come from private capital, but there are also some of it may be supported by concessional finance from international development banks, from the public finances of donor countries and so on. So how are we going to get there? Well, there's no one silver bullet and there's no one source. But when I look at that number and I look at that 6-fold increase, I think we need to tap into every source of climate finance we can. And that's where the voluntary carbon market can play a role. Now, the voluntary carbon market is much smaller. It's only a fraction of that 1.6 trillion. In fact, in its high water mark a couple of years ago, the VCM reached about $2 billion in market trading. So you might say, well, $2 billion is a lot less than 1.6 trillion. But there's a couple of reasons why it's where I think it makes sense to think about the value of the voluntary carbon market even so. First of all, I think there's room to grow. Most analyses that looked at the voluntary carbon market, and the leading one was by McKinsey as part of the task force on scaling the voluntary carbon markets a few years ago, those estimates that take into account what the kind of commitments that companies have made and the kind of supply that might be out there, estimate that the voluntary carbon market could grow to 10, 20, or even $50 billion a year. Now, that outside measure that's probably an outlier, and I'll talk in a minute about how we can reach that. But even if we increase the voluntary carbon markets by an order of magnitude to 10 or 20 billion dollars a year, that would still be an important, meaningful contribution. It would also be one that plays in particular a sort of a special role. I mentioned the role of private capital, the role of concessional finance. Carbon markets the voluntary market can provide a particular kind of finance, which is essentially performance-based. So the carbon credits are only generated when the emissions are reduced or removed. But it comes, once you get it, it kind of comes without strings attached. It looks almost like grant finance or concessional finance to the countries or the projects that receive it, because it doesn't come with a subsequent claim on equity or an interest rate like debt. So it's very interesting sort of private finance that is paid in response to performance. But once it's received, it's really valuable in terms of being kind of no strings attached. And that also means that carbon finance can leverage other forms of finance like debt or equity because it provides a return on that capital. So if we were to get to $20 billion in carbon credit volume, let's say, in the voluntary carbon market, that could easily leverage 3 or 5 or 7 times that amount. So now we're talking real money. We're talking, maybe in the range of $100 billion or so that's mobilized that wouldn't otherwise be mobilized. And that, I think, is a meaningful step towards filling that gap towards 1.6 trillion. So the potential is there. It's also, I'll note, although I don't think this is the primary purpose. I think the primary purpose should be mobilizing finance. Carbon credits, when done right, can also provide a way for companies to make and meet more ambitious voluntary targets. And I'll come back to that in a minute when I talk about incentives. Okay, so that's the potential and why I think the voluntary carbon market is worth thinking about. It's worth investing time and energy in order to reach that scale. The second thing I want to talk about is what it will take to get there, and what it'll take to get there in a way that actually has the kind of positive impact for the climate and the positive outcomes that we want. And I think about this in sort of, it's a little bit cute, but in three I's, okay? Integrity, innovation, and incentive. So those are the three conditions that we need to make sure are in place, or that we need to drive in order, in my view, for the carbon markets to reach that scale. So let's start with integrity. We at C2ES have been instrumental in building out the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. I'll describe that in a bit more detail in a minute. But one of the mantras we have at ICVCM is build integrity and scale will follow. And I think that's an important way to capture the way I think about integrity in the voluntary carbon market. We're only going to reach the kind of scale I talked about. And in fact, we only should reach the kind of scale I talk about, because we don't want to reach that scale unless we're really driving emissions outcomes if we have real integrity in the market. And what do I mean by integrity? Well, we often think about integrity in terms of supply side integrity, demand side integrity, and kind of market integrity. Supply side integrity, I think, perhaps is the most important. It's certainly foundational. What I mean by supply side integrity is that credits represent real, verifiable, durable emissions reduction. So all the things we associate with representing real and genuine emissions reductions, that's captured in supply side integrity. You can think about that as meaning that carbon credits can reliably be taken. They say they're doing what they say they're doing. That it does what it says on the tin, so to speak. So supply side integrity means that the credits are real, that they're actually driving climate outcomes. And I think the most important development over the past few years on supply side integrity has been the founding and the establishment and the growth of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, or ICVCM, the organization I mentioned that C2ES was part of, along with IETA and the British Standards Institute and the Green Finance Institute. The four of those organizations, with the boost from the Task Force for Scaling the Voluntary Carbon Market a few years ago, helped establish ICVCM, which is now an independent organization headed by Amy Merrill, who many folks will know, the long-time critical person in the carbon markets for the UNFCCC Secretariat, and chaired by Annette Nazareth, a former SEC commissioner. And ICVCM is doing something I think very important. It's setting a global threshold quality benchmark standard, so a standard for the quality of carbon credits. It's doing, and then it's assessing carbon crediting programs and methodologies throughout the market to see which of them meet that threshold for quality. So the way ICVCM did it, it defined a set of core carbon principles. These are 10 principles that are pretty familiar to most people who have followed the voluntary carbon market. They're things like no double counting, durability, permanence of emissions reductions, no leakage, additionality, all the sorts of things that are associated with ensuring that carbon credits represent real emissions reductions. There are also a couple of core carbon principles that are new, I think, to ICVCM. We made sure to include one that captures the importance of sustainable development and social safeguards, and so social and environmental benefits must be part of the carbon crediting program methodology. And we also included a principle around the consistency with transition to net zero, which basically means the carbon credits can't be doing something that maybe in the near term reduces emissions, but in the long term would be a dead end. A good example is enhanced oil recovery, using carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery. So ICVCM laid out those core carbon principles and then laid out an assessment framework, and is going in now in the process of assessing essentially the entire market of carbon credit methodologies and crediting programs that meet the standard, and methodologies that are also that meet the principles. A credit that is generated by a program that meets the standard and under those methodologies can receive a carbon crediting label. The ICVCM is through about 50% of the market. So far has actually said that a lot of existing credits, including those for grid scale wind and solar under existing methodologies, are not eligible for the CCP. So far, large shares of the market, ICVCM is saying these aren't up to snuff. The methodologies need to be updated. They need to be improved. And I think that's an important part of going through and establishing the integrity. So that's the supply side integrity, which is, I think, is the most important. Demand side integrity captures the idea of that companies, when they use carbon credits, should use them in ways that complement rather than substitute for their own actions to reduce emissions. We can talk more about it. I'm sure this will be a subject later. There are several groups that are focused on this. The Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI, has put out guidelines for this. I think there's also, though, we should note, there's research that suggests, and indeed that finds, research by MSCI and Trove and others that suggests that the companies that are using carbon credits are also the ones that tend to do the most in terms of reducing their own emissions. So when we're talking about companies that have made net zero commitments and are often using credits to meet their scope 3, their supply chain emissions that are very hard to reach, those companies are typically the ones that are also doing more to reduce their own emissions and decarbonize their own efforts. And so I think the concerns around somehow carbon credits being used to reduce ambition or to counter efforts that would reduce emissions in the supply chain or in operations and the emissions that a company can control, I think those, in my view, are overblown. And we have just, if you look at the research, I think that's not what's happening. But I think we also have guidelines from VCMI and others that can help ensure that carbon credits are used in a way that has integrity. Finally, the market integrity piece is important. I think that I'll come back to briefly when I talk about the convergence and the role of government. So integrity on the demand side, on the supply side, and markets is going to be critical. I think we have some institutions in place like ICVCM, like VCMI, to make that point. That's perhaps the most important of my eyes, but let me mention the other two really quickly and then talk about where we're headed in convergence, and I'll wrap up. The second I mentioned that I think is critical to scaling up the voluntary carbon market is innovation. What I mean by that is I think we need new forms of if we're going to get to the kind of potential I raised, 2 or 10 or $50 billion, or 10 or $50 billion a year, 10 or 20. We need new ways, in my view, of generating carbon credits at scale. A lot of the projects right now, a lot of the carbon credits now are generated through small scale projects. Those can have very important local social benefits, and I think they're very useful. But I think we're never going to get to scale unless we can generate emissions reductions and carbon credits at the scale of entire jurisdictions, countries, or states. We're starting to see this in the forest case, the LEAF Coalition, which I helped to set up several years ago. It uses a jurisdictional standard for crediting emissions from reduced deforestation. That means you can start to get emissions reductions at scale in places like Costa Rica or Vietnam or the state of Pará in Brazil. We're involved in a similar innovative approach with the Energy Transition Accelerator, which is building a jurisdictional approach for clean energy for energy emissions reductions from the power sector in developing countries. So I think we're going to need innovative approaches, still with that high integrity, but innovative approaches to generate carbon credits at scale if we're going to get to the kind of finance that can really move the needle. And then finally, we need incentives. That's the third I. This could probably fill out its own talk by itself, and it's related to this question of demand. But I'll just say it's whenever we talk to companies about buying carbon credits, they say we need two things. One, they have to be high integrity. So the companies themselves care about integrity. They don't want to get the reputational hit. But they also say there has to be a business case. So it's not enough to tell companies you have to decarbonize everything. You can't meet your targets at all without any form of carbon credits. But you should go buy carbon credits anyways as a kind of philanthropic investment. Some companies might do that, but they'll do that at a tiny scale. If it's philanthropic investment, they'll do that in the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if we want to mobilize the billions of dollars, I think we can, we need to be able to make sure there's a business case for companies. And that means making sure that there's a way for them to help meet their targets, and still do that in a way to their corporate targets, their net zero targets, and still do that in a way that doesn't reduce their own actions internally to reduce their emissions and their operations and their own direct emissions. I think the way to do that, frankly, is to think about the use of carbon credits in supply chains in scope 3. That's an area that's very, very hard for companies to reach on their own. There are multiple layers of sellers. It's very hard for them to influence, but it is an area where they could use carbon credits. And we could think about ways to make sure those credits are aligned with the company's own business case and the company's business model, so that we're really accelerating business transformation alongside emissions reduction. So we need the incentives alongside the innovation and the integrity.
No.
Let me just close. Yeah, I know.
Okay.
I'm just going to close very quickly. I know.
Thank you.
I'm just going to close by saying where are we headed, and say a couple of signposts for government. I think one key thing that we'll see in the next few years is convergence. I think we're starting to see this already between the voluntary market and some form of regulation, and that happens, I think, in a couple of ways. In the U.S., you see already market regulators like the Commodities Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission beginning to regulate market behavior associated with the voluntary carbon market. So that's not regulating the credits or requiring their use, but it's making sure that when they are used, when contracts are traded, that there's transparency, there's information, there's no market manipulation, that there's full disclosure, and so on. I think that's a really important role for government. I know the EU has done some of that similarly. We could talk about that, but I think that's an important role, and that's sort of adjacent to it's not quite regulating the market or the carbon market per se as a climate policy, but it's regulating the behavior. And then the other thing I'll say, just to close, which I think is very interesting in other markets, in particular in Asia, we're starting to see compliance market regulators or carbon policy regulators thinking about how to perhaps take advantage of high integrity voluntary carbon credits. The best example of this is in Singapore, where there's a carbon tax, but the regulator is considering allowing companies to use carbon credits to offset some of that tax, and is considering whether, for example, the ICBCM core carbon principles might be the basis of that. So I think over time, we can start to see the sort of work that ICBCM and others have done, the sort of work that's done to establish integrity in the voluntary market, come in to be used by, drawn on by regulators. And I think that will help create the kind of convergence that will both create a stronger, more robust voluntary market and also help it to meet the potential I talked about earlier. So with that, Marcia, with apologies for going long a little bit, let me stop. Thanks
no worries. It was a very, very interesting starting. So with your 3A framework, very, very interesting. So maybe let's see what Damien has to complement with.
Thanks, Marcia and Nat, and good afternoon, everyone. By background, I'm a lawyer who's been working on climate change since the time of Kyoto ratification, the establishment with Peter Viz and colleagues of the EU emissions trading system. So generally, I'd agree with a great deal of what Nat said. We are facing a real climate crisis. There is urgency for action, and therefore, I think first and foremost, action should always be welcomed. In that context, voluntary carbon markets can play a role. I think policies like the US Inflation Reduction Act, the European Green Deal, the Chinese ETS, all of these play an important role as well, and they should be complementary. I'll come back to this, but the fact that the voluntary carbon market is there shouldn't be an obstacle to taking more ambitious policies. That's an important point. In terms of Europe's experience over the last 20 years, as Nat said, there is an interaction between voluntary markets and regulated markets. In particular, Nat's last point on Singapore and working with international credits, this is something Europe has done before with the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism with joint implementation. I think it deserves more study as to how that went. It wasn't entirely positive from Europe's perspective. And so if we're going to make this work, I think people collectively, and today's seminar is an excellent sort of occasion to be looking at this, we need to see how to make it work better. There were faults in the Clean Development Mechanism. There is a role for regulators. I agree with Nat. I can say more on the Green Claims Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Directive, and others. There's absolutely a role for governments here. I think the voluntary market sees this, that it can really help, because I would 100% echo what Nat said about integrity. We've seen the scandals coming out on various projects. This can damage climate action overall, not just the voluntary market, but it can support the narrative of climate action not being something beneficial. So integrity is absolutely key. Now in Europe, we've just gone through the legislative process putting into place the European Green Deal. So that's now in law. Europe will be achieving a minus 55% reduction below 1990 levels by the year 2030 without the use of international credits. Our earlier experience of 1.6 billion tons. This brought a lot of changes. I mean, I would hope that the hundreds of millions of units that Europe bought from China are a large part of the reason why China now has moved to a compliance market. And I think this is something positive for the world that China has this. But clearly, I mean, what Europe does is not enough. If you look at the IEA report on 1.5 degrees, it's very clear that we need widespread domestic carbon pricing across the world. That's a precondition for 1.5 degrees. And if the voluntary market can help us get there, that is absolutely welcome. In terms of the complementary role, here I've been a member for, I think, a decade or so of the airport's carbon accreditation initiative. This is bottom up. It has 590 airports across the world, from Dallas to Bangalore, and they are working on offsetting residual emissions. So I think, like the ICV, like the Integrity Council, I mean, there is a focus on reducing your emissions as much as you can first, and then offsetting the residual. They're also moving at the top level of airports, there's 18 of these, to removal credits. This is, I think, what we see. I'll come back to Paris and Article 6, but having worked on this in the early 2000s, we're in a world with problems in terms of our emission trajectories. More needs to be done, and the role of offsetting here does require more national contributions, more action. You can't offset against business as usual. That won't get us to where we need to be. And I think we're encouraged in Europe by seeing the private sector moving more to removals. Here I come back to the European policy, because an advantage of carbon pricing is not just the broad incentives for changing you get across the economy. When Nat talks about the money we need invested in developing countries by pricing carbon themselves can help get them some of this way. Europe can't, and America probably won't, give sufficient finance, certainly not from government, to cover all this. So the role of countries pricing carbon themselves is really important. Europe for a decade has been helping third countries design their systems, what we got right, what we got wrong. I think California too, the New England states, New Zealand. And now we have the carbon border measure in Europe. This is also incentivizing countries to move forward with carbon pricing. So the voluntary credits definitely can help build familiarity with this, but we have to go, I think, beyond voluntary, certainly offsetting, to achieve 1.5 degrees. The removals there do play a role. And in Europe, well, our carbon pricing system has now raised, I think, 200 billion euros from a polluter pays approach. This money is being used to tackle climate change. And if you look at any of the projects that are getting media attention, whether it's in Iceland for geological sequestration, whether it's Microsoft in Sweden with biomass that's being stored, almost all of these projects are being supported from the EU carbon market by finance. The projects that we want to see are not going to be dirt cheap. I think this we've seen in the various conferences I've been at in the last years. If your credits are below €5, it's hard to claim they're going to be sort of world-changing, taking us to where we need to be. So this isn't saying there's not a role for them. I mean, what airports are doing in particular, I think full credit to that part of the aviation community for their action. But they recognize this isn't sufficient by itself, and the role of companies in their public policy advocacy is key. I think Gregor has written on this. I think I'd seen his article, and if companies are buying credits, you would also hope that they're lobbying for proper policy nationally. I know Nat and others have worked for US carbon pricing over the decades. Europe wants to be supportive on that. And the voluntary market isn't an alternative to having credible policies that price carbon, that make the changes we need. Also in Europe, we have regulations for phasing out ozone depleting substances, for getting rid of HFCs and moving to cleaner alternatives. And these really need government action, ideally coordinated across jurisdictions, working with Japan, working with the US. So in terms of the complementary role, the Green Claims Directive is there to help ensure integrity. There's an investigation currently on in Europe about airlines offsetting claims. 18 national authorities had said that there were exaggerations, false claims. So the Commission is currently assessing this. Some airlines have changed their websites already, but it's important that these are credible. I 100% agree with Nat on that. The movement to removals, I think, is quite important, permanent removals. And here Europe is on the brink of adopting, and I apologize here, I mean, there are too many acronyms, I think, in the VCM space, but Europe has the Carbon Reduction Certification Framework, the CRCF, which is in its final stages as being adopted. This should be a great way to sort of be able to show that integrity, both for permanent removals done by industry, direct air capture, biological sequestration, but also in the farming community. I think across the world, we know that more has to be done in agriculture. We also know how difficult it is to have policies that cost money in agriculture. There's far more interest in incentives, and working on these incentives definitely can raise awareness in the agricultural space and help us basically take the economy-wide action that we need. There's a danger of moral hazard. I mean, that's a note of course. I think I agree with Nat as well that in the title, I mean, skepticism should always be there. In any new market, there will be snake oil salesmen, people at the pub willing to sell you things. And honestly, a bit of caveat emptor, buyer beware, should always be there. That's my legal caveat. But credits can become an obstacle to action. We saw that with the Clean Development Mechanism, where countries didn't want to move to national policies. And that's a real shame. I mean, we need technological diffusion very fast, Solvay's processes for reducing HFC emissions, things like these. We actually saw in China that the CDM became an obstacle because why legislate when you can profit from other people buying the credits? There's so many lessons Europe's had over the last 20 years that it can share. I'm probably, Marcia, going to be running out of time quite soon. So I think in terms of how to get there and incentives, I would really emphasize Europe's multilateralism. We honestly could have so many tattoos of our adherence to the UN, the wish to progress through UN frameworks. And here, I think we saw the agreement, to many, the surprise agreement that came in Baku last week for Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. And there's a need for parties to look at this. I mean, the parties decide, and they'll be looking at this in Baku in terms of the COP endorsement. But some of the elements, I think, are really, really welcome there in terms of going beyond business as usual for baselines. I'm coming back to this point of we cannot achieve 1.5 degrees by crediting beyond business as usual. That simply won't work in terms of the maths. And so going beyond business as usual, I think, is a big achievement from the technical body working on Article 6.4. The next one is avoiding lock-in. When I see projects in America sometimes sort of generating credits from recovering foam from refrigerators, this is the kind of thing in Europe we require by law, that old refrigerators and freezers, I mean, the damaging chemicals must be recovered. And if you go down a crediting approach, you get into this kind of cherry picking where some people will do this, others won't do it. At the state level, it makes it harder to move forward. So avoiding lock-in, I think, is very important. And the third element here, I guess, would be on removals. I mean, to me, it was a surprise, the progress made on removals under 6.4. But having a buffer there, I think, is crucially important. I think we've experienced in Europe people trying to say that we had to accept removals in our emissions trading system before without really many safeguards, kind of replacing bricks with ice cubes, things that have to be replaced every 5 years. And here I loop back to integrity. I mean, in a market economy, there will always be people trying to push dodgy things. You look at the prosecutions going on right now in the US of some prominent figures involved in the carbon market over the decades. There will always be people trying to push the boundaries. And I think it's important for regulators and others to be ethical and to push back on this. We need massive action over the next 20 years. This primarily should come through regulation, through incentives from regulation. And the carbon market absolutely can play a role in terms of bringing reductions outside of that, on top of that, and also raising the awareness of what needs to be done. I think the Clean Development Mechanism did play that role. So our parties, the countries of the world, will be together in Baku in a month or so, looking at the agreement under Article 6.4. I would want to emphasize here as well, because Europe's often criticized for not providing the demand that, say, Singapore might be providing. I mean, Europe is a big market. We think through our actions before we move forward. We have also, in the context of aviation, I think we are the first jurisdiction in the world to have given certainty for the use of Article 6.4 credits. We've gone ahead of CORSIA here because we're multilateral, because we believe in Paris. We've said in our legislation, Article 11A, that Article 6.4 credits can be used by European airlines because ideally, I mean, what Singapore does and what others do, they can do it individually, but we do have a forum to get together. That forum, for me, has been the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And through Article 6.2, Article 6.4, hopefully we can have a breakthrough in this area. But for Europe, again, I mean, we know we have to do an awful lot domestically. We have a commitment to do a 90% reduction by 2040. And I think that's where the primary role of the voluntary market would be, to go beyond this. And companies who are engaged in the voluntary market, ideally they should, well, not ideally, I think they should be involved in sort of credible arguing for policy at the national level, policies that help us avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So that's as an introduction, and I look forward to the debate today. I can already see a lot of questions coming in.
Thank you very much, Damien. And it's really nice to see how your vision and Nat's vision really align. But without further ado, because we're really late, I'm going to pass it to Christoph for the debate.
Thank you, Mattia. My name is Christoph Graf, NYU. I don't want to lose a lot of time, so I would ask Peter first, and then Gregory to weigh in, maybe in 5 minutes, a statement that captures your view or relates to the keynote speeches. Peter.
Okay, well, hello everybody. I used to be working in the European Commission. You may have understood that from what Damien said. But for 5 years or so, I've been outside on the consultancy job. Let me say this. What Nat says and Damien said, it's all great stuff, and I agree with very much all of it. What to do about it? I'll hazard to throw in 2 suggestions. When the EU makes its target for 2040, and it amends its climate law to embody the 2040 target, and in effect, when it makes its next NDC, it might be prudent and helpful if the EU were to keep some option open to use international offsets. I know for the 2030 target, it's excluded. And I'm very much of the view that Europe should proceed extremely cautiously. First of all, Europe wants to be absolutely sure that they can find high quality credits, high integrity credits. But if they do so outside the confines of the European Union, it might be a good thing to keep that as an option for meeting targets in the future. And I think it might also have the contribution of enhancing the cost efficiency with which Europe meets its target. So I would say, perhaps we in Europe shouldn't be so emphatic about doing things domestically in the future if all the conditions are fulfilled for doing it well in collaboration with other countries. And the other suggestion, just the last one I'll make is, I started my life as an auditor, financial auditor. And one of the things financial auditors have to do is sign off the accounts as being a true and fair reflection. And if they have any reservations, they have to qualify those accounts. And indeed, ultimately, if they approve accounts and they're found to be fraudulent, the accounting firm can be sued. Well, all of those things could apply to and should apply to verifiers as well, I think, even in the case of the voluntary carbon markets. If their own liability was at risk, in the case of them certifying high integrity credits which do not prove to be high integrity credits, then I think there should be legal consequences. And without changing the voluntary nature of the voluntary carbon markets, I think that is it's maybe done already, Nat, you correct me, but for me, it's got to happen. It's got to be the highest quality we can possibly make the voluntary carbon market. Okay, I'll stop there. There's lots of other people on the panel and asking questions too. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Peter. Gregory, what's your take?
Sure. Thanks very much for the invitation. This is Gregory Tren from Kyoto University. I do research on the energy transition and decarbonization. So thank you very much for the very insightful sort of comments and also insights from the market from the two keynote speakers. I like this sort of format where we sort of have people, from the sort of pro-carbon VCM side, and we have people like me that are sort of, I guess, invited to be more of the sort of skeptical role. But let's be careful here so this doesn't turn into a climate change debate where we have people saying climate change exists and climate change doesn't exist. I find myself, like Peter, agreeing very strongly with many of the sort of observations from the previous two speakers. So let's first of all talk about maybe some of the comments from Nat Cohan. So I guess you were sort of highlighting the need for very, very large scale investments in clean energy. Much larger. You were talking about the scale of 6 times more than what we currently have. I think nobody's going to disagree with this. So I think if we were to apply, the need for much larger investments in clean energy to the VCM, we're talking about basically supporting renewable energy projects. And we have to remind ourselves that renewable energy projects have been some of the most controversial low quality forms of offsets on the market. Some of the problems have been basically that many of these renewable energy projects suffer from very questionable additionality that sort of occurred, in contexts or in countries basically where renewable energy is basically becoming the norm, where it sort of makes sense to sort of install renewable energy as opposed to fossil fuels. We also have the problem where many of these, projects are very aged. They're just, they're sort of just, windmills are turning. And then if we're sort of digging up fossil fuels today and sort of arguing that the fossil fuel is, made carbon neutral over the life cycle, it just seems problematic to sort of draw upon a historical avoidance action to justify the new addition of carbon in the atmosphere today. So we have sort of rules regarding the registration of these renewable energy projects today. Basically, registries like Gold Standard have, adopted quite a harsh stance now and sort of said that they can only be limited to those that occur in the least developed countries. These are extremely poor countries where renewable energy has not yet mainstreamed. So I think we need to remind ourselves of, if we're talking about, supporting clean energy across the world, with new forms of climate finance, we have to make sure that this is going to occur in the countries where this is where renewable energy is not really mainstream. And unfortunately, we're probably, because of the energy requirements of these countries, the market's not that high. Unfortunately, where the energy demand is highest, like Europe, China, Japan, America, these are these countries where renewable energy projects can no longer be considered additional. So there's a bit of a problem, I guess, in the potential for climate finance for renewable energy, and then the additionality that can be claimed from renewable energy projects. I find myself agreeing very strongly with the need for integrity. So the supply side was mentioned and the demand side. This is great. I like this very much. So in our research, we've sort of noticed that there's been lots of scientific studies that have been looking especially at the supply side and pointing out lots of problems in the methodologies. This includes very recently clean cooking stoves. We have lots of RED projects in question, renewable energy projects in question, and recently afforestation projects. So the problem with this, supply of low quality credits is this really basically destroys people's confidence in the market. And when we have low confidence in the market, this is going to decrease the flow of funds. This is going to really slow down scaling. So this is something that very urgently needs to be addressed. And so, of course, we have to sort of then think about, the demand side integrity. And I think I find myself once again agreeing very strongly with the idea that offsetting should only be considered complementary and not central to decarbonization efforts. We have to remind ourselves that the core basically mission, the core task at hand here to basically avert a climate catastrophe is to shift away from fossil fuels to an economy that doesn't emit emissions when it's in its energy system and it's in its systems of consumption. And so we have to consider there's some use cases of offsets that really morally and from the sense of climate change mitigation do not make sense. So if we think about some of the very bad practices that have occurred in recent years, we have oil companies shipping tankers of liquefied natural gas to Asia, and then claiming that this natural gas emits no greenhouse gas emissions over the life cycle. This is really, I think, stretching sort of the rules, or you could sort of say, the norms. These are sort of, I think, practices that really should be frowned upon and not really accepted. We had a comment about excuse me, the need for the shift to removal. So I again find myself agreeing quite strongly with this. The idea that companies are sort of shifting towards removals. This is a very promising message, but unfortunately, in our research, we looked at the 20 companies that are retiring the most offsets from the carbon market, and we didn't find any evidence. Actually, we looked at their buying behavior from 2020 all the way to the end of 2023. We didn't find any evidence of this, rhetorical sort of discussion about shifting to removals. We find ourselves agreeing strongly with, the Oxford principles and saying that, the long-term goal has to be durable removals, so basically engineering based removals. But unfortunately, such credits don't really exist just yet on the market. And then if they do exist on the market, we just have to remind ourselves that there's going to be many limitations, basically very limited supply, which means it's going to be a very high price for these credits. Because at this high price for the credits, this really defeats their utility as a decarbonization acceleration device. This means that it's probably going to be much cheaper for companies to actually prioritize the decarbonization activities inside the supply chain. So I think we need to sort of we have to, of course, support the scaling up of this durables of this engineering-based removals market, especially for the purpose of drawing down historical emissions. This is really important. And we also have to, I think, we can be optimistic, I guess, in evaluating the potential of these durable sort of removal credits, because they can actually be measured. The additionality is very clear. You're not going to make money by sort of, drawing down carbon from the atmosphere and just putting that in the ground. Clearly, revenue from carbon credits is going to be the decisive factor here. So this is obviously going to be very high credits. But again, we have this moral hazard issue where basically, this very sort of high quality solution on the table, that this is possibly going to delay, the intellectual sort of urgency, or sorry, the moral imperative of shifting away from fossil fuels. So I think I would like to finish there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gregory. So we have a ton of questions from the audience. So I would also ask all the panelists and speakers to help addressing some of the comments in the chat. I want to just tackle a few questions live. So I have one, and maybe Gregory, you would like to answer that. It's I'm Tosin from Lagos, Nigeria. Please, how can we harmonize the carbon markets in a way that allows value that is equitable across different jurisdictions, as well as creates access for global South participation? And I think related, another question is, do you think that digitalization and democratization and access to information, I guess, about the quality of these credits is key? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I mean, the idea of sort of ensuring that, the voluntary carbon market is equitable. Yeah, this is, I think, something that concerns all our discussions about the energy transition. One of the nice things about, the voluntary carbon market is that it does offer a means of, collecting funds from the polluting countries, which is the global north, and providing these to sort of poorer countries, for example, countries with red projects, countries, for example, that are clean cooking stoves, directing these to these villages that are still cooking with timber. This is sort of a really important sort of role that we could call this like a secondary role, perhaps a co-benefit. But we have to remind ourselves that unfortunately many of these same projects, the clean cooking stoves, Red Plus projects, have also been shown to be sort of very problematic in terms of their integrity. So I think we really need to find a way of offering very high integrity credits from the global south, because we can assure ourselves that there's always going to be a market in the global north for these. Because once again, it doesn't really matter where we're sort of mitigating carbon in the world, because there's only one atmosphere. And so if we can do that in the global south, and if we can sort of do that with money from the global north, I think very few people would think that that's a bad idea. I'll finish there.
Thank you. Another question that maybe Ned could answer. What do you see as the main specific advantage and disadvantages of carbon insetting versus offsetting? Do you know if there's a good database with carbon prices in voluntary markets? That is also like regarding the transparency, I guess.
So the second one, the database for carbon, I think the best data that's been gathered that I know of is Ecosystem Marketplace, which publishes an annual review, actually a quarterly review of the voluntary carbon market. Right now, the voluntary carbon market, most of it is over the counter, meaning there's no centralized exchanges. So to get the data, you have to go out and ask people. I think Ecosystem Marketplace has done that well. I would hope that over time, if we can get the kind of conditions in place that I said, and the voluntary carbon market can scale, we would start to see more of it on exchanges with really transparent price information and price data. So that would be actually part of what I called market integrity, would be moving to a much more transparent and open and liquid market, which I think we would expect if the efforts look to provide standards on quality like ICVCMs and so on, if those go through. The first question was about insetting. I mean, this is a long issue, or a deep issue. Let me just say something very quickly in terms of how I think about it. I mentioned that I thought the best way potentially for companies, or the highest integrity rate for companies to use carbon credits would be in their kind of scope 3. And I mentioned it would be great to find ways to sort of have that be aligned with their business principles. So I think that does point towards insetting. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying we should only allow insetting. I think there are ways to have very high quality credits be used in other ways. But the reason I think insetting is intriguing is because it potentially satisfies both the need to find ways of scaling up finance while also really drive business transformation. So for people who are worried that maybe credits are going to displace other things, I think it's a good potential solution. And the way I would think of it is at scale. So for example, if you're buying those Leaf Coalition credits that I mentioned that represent scaled reductions in emissions reduction in tropical deforestation, well, if you have tropical deforestation in your supply chain, if you're a beef company or you're a consumer goods company, then that should be considered kind of an insetting. So I'm thinking of a broad definition of credits in your value chain, and that I think could really provide a good way forward for how companies could use credits in a high integrity way.
Thank you, Nat. Final question is either for Damien or Peter. So we've been saying that in the EU, the use of voluntary carbon markets is often discouraged. So what in practice would have to change in terms of EU legislations to be like more open to the voluntary carbon markets? Do you have an idea of like what the actual things that would need to be done are?
Well, maybe if I go first. I mean, I don't think the legislation is negative to going beyond what we have in legislation. So, as I said, I mean, Europe is among the first in the world to put laws in place for airlines outside European airlines to use Article 6.4. To my knowledge, no other country has got that in law at the moment. And this integrity issue, I mean, the Green Claims Directive, the Corporate Reporting Sustainability Directive, I know there are complaints about the paperwork here, the amount of examination there has to be done. But I mean, the intention behind this is clearly to make sure that it's credible. So it's not saying don't do this. it's saying what I've heard a lot of today, that, you know, companies should be looking at reducing their own emissions, and then credits come on top. And I think Gregory's example of saying it's carbon neutral oil, I mean, we're looking at life cycle reductions of emissions there. So you must clearly distinguish whether it's in the life cycle or if it's outside of that. So yes, I mean, getting used to any new laws is effort, and there's pushback. It brings changes, but the intention behind these laws is not dismissive of the voluntary carbon market. It's rather trying to ensure integrity.
Excellent. Peter, do you want to add something to that?
Well, I think Europe, you know, really has tried to help in that respect, you know, in letting the CDM credits be used in the emissions trading system. That was an amazingly brave decision to make. And it was only through realizing that there were low quality credits that the disillusionment, if you start like, arose. But I think also policymakers in Europe are, I think, quite right to be hesitant, skeptical, and it's really for the voluntary carbon markets to prove they can do differently, or it's for the Article 6.4 subsidiary body to prove that it isn't going to just behave as the CDM governing body did. You know, it's not for Europe to give lessons to anyone else on other markets elsewhere in the world. It's absolutely for, you know, Europe would be open, I think, but it's for the other markets to absolutely ensure the high integrity of the removals or the reduction credits that they propose.
Thank you so much, Peter.
That's it.
Excellent. Simone, it's for you now time to wrap up the discussion. Unfortunately, only 2 minutes, but I think you can do it.
Okay, thanks. Such a challenging topic and such a challenging conclusion in 2 minutes. Let me wrap up very briefly. Not set the scene to incentive to scale up voluntary carbon markets. And I particularly like not the idea of supply side and demand side integrity. And then Damien built up on that, especially on the incentive, underlying the need for multilateralism, the importance of Article 6 on this, and also recalling the importance that we act domestically, first of all. Peter nicely challenged Damien on this point, arguing that, you know, EU should keep the options open to use offsets, although in a very cautious way. And finally, Gregory played very nicely the skeptical role. Let me say that I think I'm a skeptical VCM lover, in the sense that I do believe that there are important perspectives and potentialities in VCM, but still there are good reasons for skepticism. And I think there are 2 main reasons for skepticism. One is due to the limited robustness of data and methodologies, and the second is due to the potential expected socioeconomic effects. So how to deal with that? On the first, we need to increase transparency and make data, in my view, digital, accessible, and comparable. And we are on the way, but there is still a long way to go. For the second, I think we need to increase the stringency of the regulation. And here we have done a good deal with the Green Claims Directive in Europe. But let me say something that was not said before. I think we need, as a third requirement, to involve the indigenous population and the local communities in the decision process. And here it was mentioned the Brazilian state of Pará. Well, that's an interesting case, an interesting example with potentialities, with the state selling 12 million carbon credits to 30 multinationals at around $15 per ton. But there's been a lot of polemics in the last few weeks because the local communities were not, or felt they were not included, because there is also a history of past fake carbon credits that, you know, feed skepticism. And finally, there have been wildfires that destroyed an area as large as Switzerland in this year, before August. So I think we need to involve the local policymakers and local communities more. We need to increase the attention to this risk. And if I may conclude with an idea of mine that you probably know already, we need to set minimum prices because we cannot have too low prices, otherwise the credibility is gone. So probably a price corridor would work to have a minimum and a maximum price, as I've been arguing for also in other contexts. But that's a final provocation to the panelists, and I know there is no time to react for them.
The worst type of provocation, the one you cannot.
Exactly. I studied
But
about
thank
that.
you so much, Simone, for the fastest conclusion to a very complex debate that we had today. I would like to thank our brilliant speakers, Damien, Nat, Peter, and Gregory, for giving us their time and their expertise. And of course, my wonderful co-host, Christoph, thank you so much. And we will see you in a couple of months.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much. Sure. Goodbye, everyone. Bye.